Hey y'all. Today we're going to talk about chapter 16, which is industrialization in the United States following the Civil War. So there are a few important points I want to go over today. First of all, just want y'all to think about how quickly the United States went from being a primarily agrarian nation to the world's leading industrial power. This happened within a few decades, the last several decades of the 1800s. So basically, after the Civil War ended in 1865, the United States just became a very quickly growing industrial power. A lot of that had to do with the Civil War itself. Get too much into that because talking about the Civil War in this class, but just know that like the destruction of that war really opened up a lot of opportunities for new rebuilding and new growth. There are several reasons why the US became such a strong industrial power so quickly. One of those was that we have a very large country. It spans from the West Coast, where there are, great resources, gold, silver in the what we think of as like the West, California with lots of gold, and then we have all the way to the East Coast. And in between, there's lots of different resources, a variety of raw materials. So if you're looking at a country that might be the size of England, you're not going to come across the variety of natural resources just because there's not as much variety in the landscape. So the size of the US was a big benefit when it came to having access to a lot of very valuable raw materials. Another reason that the US was able to industrialize so quickly was because of immigration. There was a large labor force, a lot of people willing to work for low wages. That helped corporations grow. It wasn't great for theirs, but it was a part of the reason why corporations grew so quickly. Of course, there's a flip side of that. The reason why there was so much immigration is because there were so many jobs. So both those things kind of went together. It's kind of like a chicken and egg, scenario. But another reason that the US was able to become an industrial power was because the government supported industrial growth. Through things like patents. Patents gave inventors a financial incentive to invent all kinds of new things. So think of someone like Thomas Edison, who invented so many things within a short period of time. He was able to get paid for all of his inventions because of patents. Not all countries offered the same incentive for invention. So that definitely created more of sort of a drive for inventors. The government also supported corporations in other ways. A lot of this was corruption or borderline corruption, which I hope you notice when you read the reading from A People's History of the United States. There was a lot of corruption. So this wasn't necessarily good for the people, but it was a factor in industrial growth. It helped corporations become very, very powerful. It created a lot of problems doing so, but it is a factor in the economic and industrial boom of the US after the Civil War. So the government, I mentioned that the government was sort of working hand in hand with large companies, large corporations. A lot of this was the railroads would, they would want to acquire a lot of land to build a railroad, and a lot of times this land would be Native American land or farmlands, and they would want to use that land to build a railroad. So they would have to get Congress to agree to let them, displace the Native Americans or whatever it may be in order to get that land to build a railroad. And how would you get Congress members to support your railroad? You give them shares in your company. So Congress members were often just made like shareholders in a railroad company. And so if you own shares in a company, you want to see that company thrive. So this is where I was talking about, a bit of corruption. One way to get people to care about your industry is to make them have a financial incentive in it. So a lot of Congress members and other politicians were pretty corrupt at this time, and a lot of times they looked out for the well-being of large corporations at the expense of workers and small businesses. So this is the era of the growth of big corporations. The government had a philosophy when it came to regulating the economy, and this philosophy was known as laissez-faire, which literally means let alone or leave alone. And that was sort of the stated philosophy of the federal government. And the idea was that the government shouldn't interfere with the economy. It's sort of like interfering with nature. The economy was seen as like a kind of like natural cycle, and why interfere with that? So this completely conflicts what I just said about government supporting corporations. So there's a conflict here. The stated philosophy, the stated sort of stance for government was to let the economy do its own thing. Don't get involved. Don't regulate anything. But what was really going on was a lot of corruption under the table. So why do you think some people would be against laissez-faire, against sort of this standoff approach of the government? Well, think about all the things that we have now. We have minimum wage, Social Security, disability insurance, workers' comp, overtime on an 8-hour day, 40-hour work week, safety regulations, especially if you work in something like construction or factories. Those companies have to adhere to strict safety codes. All of these things did not exist in the late 1800s because of laissez-faire. The government was basically saying it's not our job to regulate the economy. Therefore, we have no right to tell a corporation that they have to pay their workers a minimum wage, or that they have to provide workers' comp or any sort of safety regulations. And of course, the biggest one was, overtime. Like, people had to work sometimes 12, 14, 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. So a lot of those workers did not like the idea of laissez-faire. They wanted government to step in and give them some rights and protections as workers, make sure that they were paid a living wage, make sure that they, weren't going to get an arm sliced off doing their job. And if they did get an arm sliced off in a factory, they would get some sort of disability compensation. At this time in the late 1800s, when laissez-faire was sort of the ruling principle, if you got hurt at work or in any scenario and you were unable to work, you were just kind of out of luck. There was no government agency to help you through that. If you couldn't work, then you were just on your own. And this is laissez-faire economics. The government was not going to regulate or control any aspects of the economy. So corporations loved this. They loved not having to pay people a minimum wage or offer them overtime. But workers hated it. They were being abused. They were getting paid terrible wages, barely enough to live on, working in very unsafe conditions, very dangerous, uncomfortable conditions. And like I said, maybe 14 hours a day. And if they didn't want to work those many hours, then they would get fired. And because of the vast amount of workers, their job would be replaced by someone who was desperate enough to work 6 days a week, 14 hours a day, which sounds awful. So workers were very much opposed to laissez-faire economics. One thing that they started to do after the Civil War was to form unions, and this was a way that they were trying to have more bargaining power. So workers in a specific industry, let's say mining. Sorry, I had to sit outside today because the weather's beautiful, but some very loud vehicles going by. So let's just say mining, for example. The miners had a very extremely dangerous job, and mine owners would hire children because they could pay them less, because the children were smaller and they could often get into smaller spaces. So workers basically wanted the government to do more. So they started unions, and the unions basically said, you know, all of the workers at this particular mine are going to join this union. And so if you don't adhere to, there's a train, I'm going to go inside. If the employer does not adhere to certain demands of the workers, then all of the workers would quit or go on strike. And this gave workers a lot more clout. It gave them more bargaining power, because all of a sudden there was like a bunch of them on board. So you're not gonna, if you're the owner, you're not just gonna lose one worker, you're gonna lose your entire labor force if you don't adhere to some of their demands. So labor unions became a very powerful bargaining tool in the late 1800s, and it just gave workers some sort of power. So unions were fighting against all of the things I mentioned, the terrible conditions for workers and the terrible pay, but they were also fighting against this idea that corporations have so much power. So if y'all have already read chapter 11 of A People's History of the United States, I hope you noticed the 14th Amendment, the use of the 14th Amendment. So the original intent and purpose of the 14th Amendment was to protect African American rights after the Civil War, after the end of slavery. And the way the 14th Amendment is phrased is that no person can be denied their rights without due process of the law. However, corporations became so powerful, mostly because they had friends in the Supreme Court and friends in Congress, and these friends owned part of the corporation. So of course they want to support those corporations. So all of this sort of corruption ultimately led the Supreme Court to make a really strange decision. And in this decision, they said that corporations are defined as people, which sounds really crazy, but the reason that they made this decision was because the 14th Amendment protects the rights of people. So if corporations are legally defined as people, then the 14th Amendment protects the rights of corporations. So they came to this decision as a way to avoid paying a minimum wage. So workers wanted a minimum wage, and corporations were saying, no, it's our right. It's our right to decide what we want to pay you. And workers were saying, well, you know, this is inhumane. Corporations were saying, well, we can't be forced to do anything without due process of law, meaning it would have to go before the court before workers were able to force them to do anything like provide a minimum wage. So the 14th Amendment was an extra sort of bonus for corporations to not have to comply with the potential laws that workers wanted them to comply with and wanted the government to enact. So the 14th Amendment protected the power of corporations by defining them as people. So you could no longer infringe on the rights of a corporation because the 14th Amendment protects the rights of people, which now became corporations as well. And this still exists. About 15 years ago, I remember seeing people kind of protesting against this, and they were holding up signs that said corporations are not people. So you may have heard this term, corporations are not people, and this is where it comes from. This idea that even now corporations are defined as people and therefore they have certain rights, which is crazy. So another thing going on in the late 1800s was like the growth of really big businesses. Those mostly started with railroads. Railroads are super expensive, and therefore they need a lot of financial contributions. They need a lot of investors and shareholders. So they started this practice of getting people to buy stocks. in their company. So when you buy a stock, you put money into a company. And this was necessary because that was the only way railroad companies would come up with enough money to construct something as massive as a railroad across the country. So this started the idea of corporations. The railroads were the first corporation. Others followed, and it started this sort of trend of smaller, weaker businesses not being able to compete. Corporations took over. So by 1900, 1% of all corporations controlled 33% of the nation's manufacturing output. So this was the time when smaller businesses were just kind of dying off. And I'm sure y'all are familiar with Darwinism, survival of the fittest. And in nature, this means that weaker species, weaker animals, weaker plants will die off, and stronger ones will keep reproducing, and therefore the species as a whole will become stronger because the ones with the weaker traits die, the ones with the stronger traits live and they reproduce, and so those stronger traits keep getting passed on. So this is kind of seen as a good thing for nature, survival of the fittest. Charles Darwin, who came up with this idea, did not mean for it to relate to people. But in the late 1800s, a lot of people began to say, yeah, this relates to people, and they called it social Darwinism. And they used it to justify things like not paying a minimum wage, not paying disability insurance. The idea was that, oh, if you are disabled and you can't work, then in a sense, you're weaker. And so Darwinism says we should let the weaker ones die so that the stronger ones prevail to make our human race stronger. So social Darwinism was a very the most uncompassionate thing I could think of. It related to weakness, not only physically, but also like mentally. So poor people were seen as weaker or inferior. And for the benefit of the country and the human race, it's in our best interest to let them die so that the stronger, more intelligent members of society prevail and continue to reproduce. So people use this to justify the power of corporations. So somebody like John D. Rockefeller, who still remains the richest person who ever lived, he owns Standard Oil. His company began sort of buying out and putting out of business smaller oil companies. And this was justified by the argument that, well, Rockefeller has shown himself to be superior. He has superior business sense. He's superior in intellect. Therefore, it is in our best interest to let his companies kill all the smaller, weaker companies so that the stronger one prevails. So social Darwinism was justification for big corporations sort of taking over and killing small businesses. And it was also justification for not helping poor people, not helping those who were deemed as physically or mentally inferior. So whenever I think of the late 1800s, I think of like a really kind of harsh time. Poor people were sort of looked at as like, it's your fault. It's your fault you're poor, and therefore it's in our best interest that you should not reproduce and not continue to create more people like you. Keep this in mind when we talk about eugenics in a couple of weeks, but like, I definitely want y'all to be familiar with this idea of social Darwinism. It's kind of a heartless idea. So if you haven't yet read chapter 11 of A People's History of the United States, please look out for something called the Acres of Diamonds. I want you all to pay special attention to the speech based on a book called Acres of Diamonds. And that's a really good kind of display of social Darwinism at its worst, in my opinion. So another effect of industrialization was that there are a lot of new jobs being created. This opened up more opportunities for a middle class to grow. More and more people began to enter the middle class. And this had some really interesting effects on women. A lot of middle class women began to get jobs. So prior to this time period, the only women who worked were poor. So the idea was that, you know, women stay home, men work, but that didn't apply to poor people. Poor women always worked. What was new in the late 1800s was that there were middle class jobs opening up for middle class women. Things like department store clerks, secretaries, typists, like assistants, assistants to like executives, teachers even. So a lot of middle class women were working what they considered respectable jobs, and these women were kind of taking on more independence. Education, higher education became more prevalent for women. More women were getting college degrees, and therefore becoming a little bit more financially and socially independent. So women became a little bit more in the public eye. Still not in the public eye, but more so than before. It became more acceptable for women to have a public voice. And, you know, I'm saying more acceptable because it wasn't really acceptable at all prior to this. So the door was slowly opening up, but not so much so that, you know, people started to turn their back on the idea that women are supposed to stay home. That was still true. But the process was beginning to change. So the textbook talks about the cult of domesticity, and that just means this idea that women's job is to take care of the home, and men's job is to be in the public world. Women are in the private world. So because of industrialization and the growth of the middle class, this was starting to change very slowly. Women were becoming more educated and having more of a political voice. So, you know, they still couldn't vote, but except in a couple states. But they were beginning to be more politically active through different avenues, mostly prohibition, the banning of alcohol. So just keep in mind the door has kind of starts to open for women a little bit because of industrialization in the late 1800s. So I will end this video here. I don't want to make these things too long, but if y'all have any questions about anything I said or anything I didn't mention, please email me, or better yet, ask in the discussion on the discussion board so everyone else can see your question and see my answer. And maybe other people can chime in with their answer. That would be great. I would love to hear what y'all have to say, what y'all think about industrialization. Oh, one more thing. I'm sorry. I jumped the gun. Around 1893, the worst depression in American history began. And so the period of the 1890s is a period of economic depression. And we'll get back to this, but I just want to go ahead and bring it up now so you can start thinking about this. 1890s depression, really, really bad. It led to a lot of labor strife, a lot of very angry workers striking and becoming more volatile, more angry, more desperate. So there were a lot of pretty serious strikes in the 1880s, but especially 1890s. All right, y'all. See you later.